request of raising your hand, and I will kind of try to keep an eye who if you have specific comments. But before we kind of move into that, I would like the panelists to discuss a little bit about the core themes for today. And I think we could start with definitions, or more like perspectives around quantified self. And maybe shall we start with Jessie? So I was kind of interested in your perspective on quantified self a little bit. Can you tell us about that?
Yes. So first, it may be useful to remind that quantified self is not new. It dates back to the 16th century, where there were first experimentations with an Italian physician called Santorio, who created different instruments to measure the physical body, the thermostat, or different kind of measures also to different types of equipment to measure other body and physical activities. And it has, of course, accelerated with the digital advancement, the miniaturization of the technologies, and also the huge advances, technological advances and progresses with the emergence of quantified self technologies, bracelets, smartwatches, trackers, sensors, and so forth. We can capture more precise data, real-time data, and massive data. The quantified self movement emerged as Professor Hebb said, as a community, a pioneer community in the US in 2007. It was a group of a collaboration of people, of users, and also tool makers who shared the common interest of quantifying their physical body measures, and so to people who are interested in self-tracking. And the philosophy behind the quantified self movement is really to use quantifiable data to gain deeper insight on one's physical or health activity. In a research that I conducted with my colleague, we also suggest another definition around these smartwatch and bracelets. So these smart technologies, we suggest that they could be defined as a deliberate system of surveillance worn on the self, which can also be extended because we observe that people use assemblage of several technologies. So they have the smartphone, and then they have the smartwatch, and sometimes they have also other devices that they add. And this system of surveillance can affect cognition, connection, and also affection. So this, I would say this is my definition of quantified self. So the ones that were provided, of course, I subscribe to them, and then we highlighted these different dimensions in our research.
Yeah, I very much like this kind of different approaches of different aspects that you described. What about Andreas? What is quantified self for you, and how do you approach it?
Okay, well, I can refer very well back to what Jessie said. I think what is important when we're talking about this phenomenon is to make a clear distinction between the so-called quantified self movement, so this pioneer community on the one hand, and if you're talking about everyday self-tracking, self-measurement, the datafication of everyday life. So this is really something fundamental different. And in popular discourse, so press coverage, it's very often just mixed. So one might pose the question, why is it important to make this difference? From my point of view, it is important because by making this difference, one can understand what's going on with these kinds of groups, with these kinds of pioneer communities. So the so-called quantified self movement, this was founded by Kevin Kelly and Gary Wolf in Silicon Valley, so in the Bay Area, by really with the idea of framing this term and building around this term a group of people who pushes particular kinds of ideas. So first of all, they started with small meetups in the home of Kevin Kelly. Then there were other meetups in other cities. in the US, for example, in New York, partly organized by people who were in the original meetups. Then there was a conference planned, there was online coverage started, and so on and so on. And it was also an engagement of the spread of this idea. And the crucial point here is, in my perspective, much thinking of the quantified self in this narrow sense is linked to what was called Californian ideology. So the idea of changing the world by technologies, particular kinds of understanding of development of personality, an understanding of in society which has a which is very, very much centered on the individual, far less on the public, on common goods, and so on and so on. And something different is when we are talking about self-measurement, which has, of course, a quite long history, also in Europe, far beyond what is called quantified self. And what technologies changes there might change there or not. So this is a much broader phenomenon. And I think it is important to make the distinction to get an understanding of what the role of the quantified self, so of this movement, is within this broader phenomenon. When we just mix it, we cannot make we cannot grasp this interrelations. And in my perspective, it is important to investigate the role of such pioneer communities, because they push particular ideas, they push particular ideologies which we might share or might not share.
Thank you. So yeah, I agree that sounds like a pretty important distinction to make also for the purposes of our panel today, kind of exactly where to kind of where to kind of put the focus on. But maybe we could continue a little bit with the kind of implications. So how does it relate to societal or organizational processes? And shall we start with Jessie again?
Yes, of course. This quantified self or self-quantifying phenomenon that we observe is of course we could think of it as an individual activity, because when we talk about the self, we think of the individual who gains knowledge about him or herself. The characteristic of these self-tracking technologies is to provide knowledge, and especially knowledge that was invisible. So we get information on how good we slept, for instance, how many calories we eat per day, number of steps, all this kind of information that we probably were not aware of. So there is this idea of gaining awareness, and also having this possibility also to track precisely body and physical activity. But what is also very interesting is that these technologies, because they gather and collect a lot of data, they offer also comparisons with others. So it's not only on individual activity, it's really a social phenomenon, because what is interesting is of course to get your data, but also to see if you are in the mean, if you are in the first quartile, at the end, the last, I don't know, the first quartile, and so forth. So this ability to compare to others is something that people may also look for when they adopt this kind of self-tracking technologies. I think that what is also very interesting in the societal changes that we can see is that these technologies can also be used for surveillance, and this is what social actors or users sometimes they feel that the data goes somewhere. They know that the data goes somewhere in large databases that belongs to the GAFA companies or other IT providers. But that's something that they also mention. We don't know exactly what they do with the data. They have more data than us because they give us weekly report or monthly report. So we are able to see some information about us, but we know that they have probably much more information, and they don't provide and then they don't share everything with us. So this question and this issue of surveillance is more and more present, but that's not, I mean, that can be a reason for why people don't want to adopt these technologies, but we observe that more and more people are willing also to participate to the game, I would say. These quantified technologies, they also, in a sense, they also contribute to the informational society that Manuel Castells describes in his book, The Information Age. So we are living in an information age and informational society. And this particular form of organization creates, process, transmit information. And this is the primary source of power and productivity. So with these technologies, and especially with the self-quantified technologies, we contribute this to the informational age. And the extensive data that are collected, they can then produce this surveillance society that we live in. At the organizational level, I would say that some companies or organizations also invest in these tracking technologies, especially for productivity. I remember a paper from Helmholtz et al. In which they compared how sleep data so the company had implemented a tracker to record sleep information, and how sleep data relates to employee performance. So this can be also a way for companies to reorganize or reorder probably work and make it more efficient. So yes, that would be my first element of answers.
Yeah, we're gonna probably go back to that efficiency part, because I think that's also in relation with the main theme of the conference, which has to do with time. So we'll come back to that particular one. Thank you, Andreas. What about for you? The societal and organization, the impact to societal and organizational processes.
Well, I maybe a little add on what Jesse said on the point about data and surveillance when it comes to these technologies. What I think what it is important to have in mind is what Nora Draper and Joe Turow had called digital resignation. So what I meant by this is that people in every day nowadays are confronted with the fact that when they want to use particular kinds of technologies, like in that case, technologies of self-measurement, they have to accept some ways of how the data is related and how this data is used, and mainly used for economic purposes. They even would not like from their own perspective. And the result of this is on various levels, digital resignation. So one might ask, what has this to do with organizations? The interesting point in my perspective is that, and this is exactly what Draper and Turow pushed forward in her paper on that topic, that corporations and also other kinds of organization cultivate this digital resignation. So in the sense of they have an interest in the data, yeah, and instead of putting the users into a position of making a decision on their own if they want to donate their data in a particular way, for example, to larger projects, they have to accept the rules these companies and organizations set. And I think from a normative point of view, this is really something very crucial. We have to think, and we have to reflect on, because this is a deep conflict on the reason why this data is collected. Because from a point of view of the individual, he or she collects this kind of data for individual purposes, for personal development, for solving particular kinds of problems. Yeah? And this brings me to another point in that area when we discuss questions of change. We also did empirical research on everyday use of these technologies. And one of the results we had is that we must make a distinction between what we called pragmatic self-trackers on the one hand and enthusiast. Most people are pragmatic self-trackers. So they have a particular kind of, let's say, problem they want to solve. They have a sleep problem, they have a disease, they want to improve themselves in a particular kind of area and so on. And these kind of people very often use these self-tracking technologies for a particular phase of their life. So until they can address or could address the problem and somehow solve this problem from them. So this is one thing. And this means something for the data they collect. Yeah? On the other hand, you have what we can call enthusiasts. So they imagine, or they are very close to the imagination of self-tracking in the realm of quantified self, of the quantified self movement, even if they often do not know about this movement. And they just start to collect everything because they feel somehow triggered by the possibilities and by getting a deeper understanding about their own persons on various levels. Digital resignation, you can see in both, for both groups of people, for both kinds of self-trackers. But of course, it means something different if you're talking about people who collect a limited amount of data in a particular kind of area to solve a particular kind of problem, or if we're talking about data which is continuously tracked in a kind of mass self-surveillance, or however you want to call this. So this is one thing when it comes to this question of organizational processes. The other thing is when we again talk about a quantified self-movement, we even should have a look on this as a kind of organization. Yeah? So for sure, it's not a formal organization. It's more kind of more open structure they have. But nevertheless, they have an organizational elite which cooperates. They have built up structures. They have built up conferences, and they have tried for a very long time to push particular kinds of ideas, including doing consulting. For example, in the area of healthcare and other kinds of areas. So I think it is also important to have a look on the quantified self-movement from this perspective to understand how this pioneer community at least curates our discourse, or tries to curate our discourses around self-measurement.
I think it's really kind of interesting what you're suggesting. Just to clarify that, kind of do you think this quantified self kind of has or as you mentioned here, the Californian spirit? It is because a lot of the kind of the innovations and a lot of the actual softwares that we currently use in organizations are coming from this particular area in the world. Are you kind of suggesting that quantified self movement is a big part of this ideology?
Yeah, well, I'm very ambivalent about that. So it's a complex thing. I wouldn't say, I think it would be problematic just to say they are bad. So they do bad things or whatever. So these are people who really believe in the idea to make the world better by collecting this kind of data. But if you take a more sociological point of view and try to get an overview, you begin to realize that there are various such groups of people in the Bay Area, and you can figure out a particular kind of pattern. So we have called it life cycle of such pioneer communities, which means You have in Silicon Valley many such groups around. So in do-it-yourself, for example, hacking, open source, whatever. And you can understand these various groups as a kind of contextual figurations. And within these whole groups, you again and again have moments when very specific groups of people find together dedicated to a particular kind of topic. Yeah? If it is making, if it is quantified selves, so self-measurement, if it is data journalism, like in the case of hackers, and so on. And they then very often call themselves movement, in spite of not being a movement in a sociological sense of the word, and try to build up particular kinds of structures to push forward their ideas. Yeah? On the one hand, because they believe that they are good ideas. On the other hand, of course, part of these ideas is this American Silicon Valley kind of thinking. They are quite successful in spreading their ideas because of these open structures of curation. So because they do not build closed organizations, closed companies, but more work like a kind of think tanks. So we argue that these pioneer communities are a hybrid between think tanks and social movements. And I think from a critical point of view, the crucial question is, at which point do we share or want we share the values these pioneer communities try to promote? And at which point do we think these are values, these are understandings of society we do not share? And from my point of view, the crucial point, especially from a European perspective, is that the value of the public goods, the common goods in Europe are much higher than the understanding which is pushed forward by such groups. And we in Europe must ask ourselves, what do we buy in? If we take over this kind of thinking, where it is supportive, where it is a help, where can it be translated to what we consider as important values, and where is the conflict? So, and around this, I would say we should have a really open discourse. We need research on that. And we also must ask ourselves, why do we all the time again and again look at Silicon Valley when we're talking about change? So it's also a question. So, but these are more normative questions. Beside that, I would say we need to investigate this phenomenon in a more comprehensive way.
Very good. Let's maybe take a step back and talk about the time. So moving maybe to a third question, and that third question would be: how would you ground a politics of time into the processes of quantified self? And I'm gonna hand it over to Jessie to kind of touch this a little bit.
Yes. Just before answering the question on time, I just wanted to go back on this idea of digital resignation. So I've myself gone through it because I had Samsung Health on my smartphone and they updated their conditions of use, and I decided to refuse them. And so now I can no longer participate to the competitions and collaborative challenges. So that's really a choice that has to be made. And in the study that we conducted with my colleague Jean-François de Moya, we also found, when we asked people the motivation, why did you buy the technology, or sometimes it was a gift, we were also able to see that most of the times it's because they were perceiving more value than risk. And so the idea was to lose weight or make more exercise. So this idea of pragmatism or utilitarian goals was very much present. Some people also were looking for reassurance. They wanted to make sure that everything was okay. So this idea of having information on their health and probably not having to go to the doctor to check regularly different information. So that was also part of their motivation. So reassurance and utilitarian objectives. Regarding the question of time, I would say that these quantified self technologies, their goal is really to change behaviors. Generally, at the heart of these self-tracking, there is this idea of changing behaviors. And so to change behaviors, they will provide objectives to be reached. They will send notifications to the users and recommendations on how they can improve one aspect of their life. And so these notifications are sometimes injunctions, like injunctions to work. Okay, you spend enough time on social media or the internet, now you need to focus on your business application, or you need to take 6,000 steps, so you need to go out. And this kind of notifications that come, that can arrive on the smartphone, I would say that they can be related to external interruptions. So there's been research on interruptions at work, but I would say that now these interruptions are not only at work, they are part of our everyday life. So it's like a fragmentation of our time. So when we receive the notifications, we still have the agency power to ignore the notification, or to act or react quickly, or to wait and to decide if we are going to do the action later. So we still have this agency, but at the same time, this is going to stop what we were doing. So there will be a pause in our current activity. So that's one thing. And there are also internal interruptions, because people also develop the habit of checking their self-tracking technologies. Even without the notifications, they will stop and check regularly. Calories, steps, heart monitoring, stress level, or even mood, because there are now applications that can also provide information on your mood. So this can also become a habit, and people then get probably used to sequence their day, or the 1 hour in checking regularly their smart devices. We can also wonder if these actions of checking regularly or continuously this kind of information, if it does not lead to more stress actually. So I think that time is really at the heart of these practices, how we constantly check our information.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Again, I think discussing these questions of time, it is a help to make this distinction between the quantified self-movement in a narrow sense and self-tracking in a more broader sense. So what Jesse was talking about was this broader phenomenon of self-tracking, self-measurement. Maybe I have one little addition on this, and this is the point of recursivity. So while human practice always had been recursive, what changes with these kind of technologies is the speed of how these loops of recursivity take place. So you have an ongoing feedback loop of what you're doing, what your patterns are, how to react on these patterns, and so on and so on and so on. And of course, if you are within that, this makes something with you, and this makes something with your own practices. This is the crucial idea of using that kind of technologies. I, from my point of view, would contextualize this in, well, the more broader phenomenon of recursivity. So what we have in this digital society, in this deeply mediatized society, is exactly this increase of the speed of the feedback loops of recursivity across all platforms, across all our life. And there I would say these self-measurement technologies are only part of this. So it's a broader phenomenon. And I also would say we should have a focus on that as this broader phenomenon. So not only discuss self-measurement, but see it as part of this more broader phenomenon. So this is what I would like to say on this everyday level. When it comes to focusing on the quantified self movement, or let's say in general on pioneer communities in the sense of temporality, the interesting thing of these groups of people is that they are somehow the time ahead. So when we had the formation of the quantified self movement, the spread of these technologies was not there. There was not the Apple Watch. Fitbit was still a little company, and in the beginning, even with another name. There was no related OS system by Google, and so on and so on and so on. So this mass phenomenon did not exist. And these pioneer communities produce awareness around a particular technologically related phenomenon ahead of that time. And people being part of these pioneer communities, they experiment in that area before it becomes widespread and everyday. And there, when it comes to temporality, from my point of view, the interesting thing is that the experimental practices of these pioneer communities are not taking one-to-one on everyday level. You have various processes of translation in between. And partly these processes of translation relate to organizations, for example, companies or startups who are built around these pioneer communities. So in the quantified self-movement, you can think about the Aura Ring as one example, and how they try to translate these ideas into everyday products, but also large companies like, let's say, Apple or Google or whatever, Fitbit, which is now part of Google. So, and furthermore, you have a translation in the public discourse. What we could figure out is that around all these pioneer communities, there is a public discourse, there's a media coverage on the quantified self-movement, on the maker movement, and so on and so on. And in this media coverage, the experimental practices of these pioneer communities are very often framed as somehow strange, weird. And then the journalists or authors try to translate it in the sense, what can it mean for the everyday user? And this is another moment of this process of translation. So in a nutshell, I would say when it comes to temporality, these pioneer communities, all of them are dying after a certain time, or what means dying, become part of this further figurational, of this further context of figurations out of which they originally emerged. So they shrink, they become core groups again. Because you cannot be always pioneering, always ahead of the time. It is part of this idea of pioneer communities say, it is a limited of time when you can introduce the new. And the interesting thing then is that what is introduced by these pioneer communities never ever comes into a life one-to-one. Alive, I mean, by that widespread in everyday life in many societies. It is translated in various ways. And here, I think when it comes to temporality, it is worth to have a detailed look on these different processes of translation, because by that, you can see how within particular societies or within particular cultural contexts, the original ideas become appropriated and become something different by that. So this is the second level of temporality, I think, which is of importance.
Jessie, do you have a reaction to that?
So I really like this idea that Professor Heb just shared around this, first, the loop of recursivity, the fact that we get instantaneous feedback, and this is also what makes us react, and so we get information very quickly, we can react on it very quickly. So this loop of recursivity is a very interesting concept. And I think that immediacy is probably one of the key affordances of these self-tracking technologies. Regarding the quantified self-movement and the temporality and how they experimented with self-measurement without all the advanced technologies that we have nowadays is also very interesting, because in a sense, they had the vision, but they did not have the tools yet, not all the tools. And now we only see the acceleration of that in the society. And I think probably also for the general population, it just becomes natural to have all this information, but that's not that much natural. And they don't even realize the depth of data, of awareness that we can have nowadays. So would be interesting to see how other communities will probably also develop around now these technologies, and which steps can be taken further on that.
Very good. So I'm wondering, should we open the floor for some reactions or some comments from the audience? So if you have one, just kind of push it in your hand so I can find it. I know that Leo Banku had put in here in the chat an interesting fact. I'm reading. In the period from January to March, inclusively, Europeans purchased 22 million wearable gadgets, smartwatches, fitness trackers, fully wireless headphones, etc. This is exactly 1/3 more than the first quarter last year. And then there's a fix that in 2021. And Andreas has kind of answered in here. So, Andreas, do you wanna say something about this?
Yeah, well, it's more a kind of extension on that. Yes, this is a very important fact. So the spread of these technologies. What we found, and what other kind of data also says, is that the interesting or the crucial point always is to look how long do people track. So how long do they use it for self-measurement? Or for measuring something particular. And here you have somehow the distinction between pragmatic self-trackers or pragmatic users and enthusiasts. So somebody who does everything just because it can be done and he or she is fascinated in this possibility, and others who, I don't know, buy a particular kind of device to address a specific problem they have. Of course, you cannot relate this one-to-one to statistics. There can be several reasons behind, but I think this is one aspect, or at least my assumption is that it is one aspect.
Jessie, do you want to add to that answer?
Yes, so I think that there are also users who stop using the quantified self. So once probably also, if the objective was to make more exercise, probably once they get to the habit, then some of them also stop using the technology. So it's not always long-term usage. Some people also see it as a gadget. So they had it they received it as a gift. So they will be enthusiastic at the first, and then after a while they will stop using it. So there can be different, I would say, different paths of adoption, and longitudinal studies especially are useful to see how usage evolve over time. Also, if there is effective usage, because having the technology does not mean that the person is going to use it at the most. And some people just focus on, I don't know, a number of steps, and other people have the complete assemblage with many other technologies for the weight or the calories and so forth. So they are, I would say, probably advanced or expert users who are really collecting, buying or acquiring different types of technologies to have the most complete view possible. And some users are just probably beginners, and after a while, they also stop using the technology. So we see different, I would say, different paths or different types of adoptions.
Yeah, I wanted to kind of return maybe a little bit about that, because for me, I think one of the interesting thing about kind of how you mentioned on your research has to do with this kind of affective component related to the usage of these wearables. I think that is actually it's somehow to me that I don't know, do I feel that is there some kind of contradiction in terms of with quantified self? I'm usually thinking a lot of data, mathematics, statistics, this kind of logic. But then there also seems to be kind of this, especially if it's used for, I don't know, running or things like that, there seems to be this kind of interesting affective component. So I think that is actually a pretty interesting observation.
Mm-hmm. I think that, and that's probably also a limitation of these technologies, because not all of them take into account the affective part. I know that some recent investment of Fitbit, now they provide also this meditation modules that people can also add to their technology to have precise information on their stress, mood, and so forth, and meditation level. So that's a new feature that they provided recently. But most of these technologies really focus on the statistics. So people become statistical subjects, and all this affective part is left sometimes outside of the technology. In our research, we were able to see the affective dimensions because people were talking about this reassurance and also feeling of guilt. When they don't meet the objectives, some of them, I remember in the interviews, a woman saying, I was tired, I was about to go to bed, but then I realized that I checked the phone and I saw that I did not meet the objective of, I don't remember how much steps she had to take. And so she went out with the dog to take a walk before going to bed. So the feeling of guilt is sometimes very strong for some individuals. The ones who are also part of communities and who do the challenges, they know that the others will also see their stats. So they want also to comply with the group. So this guilt part was interesting in our findings because then, yes, there is affect, especially because it can be a social experience. So you know that others will look at your statistics. You don't want to be too bad in comparisons to others. And that's also, I would say, the motivational power of the technology to make people act.
So I saw Simon Ford had added here a question. Simon, do you want to ask Simon the question?
Yes. Yeah, thank you for this presentation. Yeah, I'm just interested in the second dimension of the workshop about control and self-control, and I wanted to know if there is a link between self-quantification, the quantified self-movement, and control, and are this QS technology integrated into a control mechanism, or can we see this QS technology as control technologies?
Andres, do you want to touch that first?
Yeah, well, I can say something on this. I just put also a link into the chat if you want to extend on this, Simon. So from my point of view, really here it is very important to make this distinction between quantified self-movement and self-measurement. So the quantified self-movement, they have the project of N1. So it is only about collecting data for one person, which has a lot to do with self-development, with emancipation, which making this individual strong. So these are the ideas, and these are words they are using, and they themselves are skeptical about using this data on a large scale, for example, companies. Of course, it is something different when we are talking about individual self-trackers. For them, it is partly of gathering a better control of their practices, of having this kind of feedback loops, which is again something different if you're talking about companies or organizations which are active in this field of self-measurement, who try to get organizational control alongside from data. So these are what you're hinting on is, from my point of view, something very important. My answer on it is we have to discuss these different levels separately to get an understanding of what is going on. So it would be too easy just to say it's a push into a society of control. It's much more complicated what's going on there.
Jesse, do you want to add to that?
Yes, I would also recommend so I definitely agree with what Professor Hebb said, because there are different levels if it's only for yourself or if it's quantified self in an organizational setting. And the paper from Kellogg et al. 2020, they talk about this algorithmic control and how it changes or replaces bureaucratic control. So here we are really in the organizational setting, and the usage of quantified self is used to organize a new type of control of the individuals based on the comprehensiveness of the technology, the instantaneity, the interactivity, but also opacity, because behind the algorithm, we barely know what there is, and sometimes we don't even understand how it works. So we know that they collect data and that there are mechanisms. So it's also, it can be also a strength for the company or for the organization exerting the control. So.
Thank you. I saw that there are several interesting questions now on the chat. Shall we take one from Francois on business models?
Yeah, to maybe to rephrase it. I have several apps in my smartphone, and they quantify myself differently. And behind these different and multiplicity of self, there are also different business models. And I was wondering if it will not be a problem at some point for all of us to coexist with multiple selves grounded in different business models. It doesn't seem to be the case now. If I take my own experience, I have several selves quantified and several temporalities quantified as well. Personally, it's not really a problem, but I have also more and more apps like this in my smartphone. Maybe in 2 years, I won't say that. So I would be interested in your opinion about that, the multiplicity of the self quantified by techniques and the becoming of that. Should we be worried? Will the business model between themselves regulate each other, making it less a problem or not?
Jessie, do you want to answer that first?
Yes. So clearly the business model is also at the heart of the development of these technologies, and that's also why Alphabet holding acquire Fitbit, because there's great potential to aggregate data from different data. So as you said, we have multiple mobile apps, and so this data then goes to different databases on the cloud. And what may be worrying is when the data goes to the same actor. So we all think of Google, but when they probably cross all the data that they have on our search engine request, and then the time we spend on the internet, and then the mobile apps that we have, and so forth. So they get a lot of information, and that's how they also that's how they improve their advertising business models. So that's why we have more personalized ads, recommendations, and so forth. So that's I would say that's very powerful on their side. We can also think of insurance companies that now provide policies that can be less expensive depending on the if you use a smartwatch, for instance, or if you accept to share this kind of data with the insurance company, they can provide more interesting deals. So there are, of course, economic issues behind these mobile apps and quantified self-helps. I will say that for sure we have another double, which is based on our data. So we have our own identity, but we have also this statistical self, which is available online to different providers. What would be my first concern is that more and more these data go to the same actors. So the GAFA, but also other large companies. And the more information they have on us, and also the more sensitive it becomes. And this is where probably we need to exert how our free will and to say stop to the situation. So we tend to observe digital resignation. More and more we accept this kind of situation. But I think that in Europe, we already have GDPR, and there is also the California Management Act in the US. So we see that these privacy issues are really at the heart of the discussion. So these are really important questions to think of. And there are also designers who work on the privacy by design. So to take that into account in the technologies that we have, so that we can also gain more control and be able to select the kind of information or the kind of data that we would like to share. So that's something that should be probably generalized to have this kind of design approach with the technologies. But so far, I would say that, yes, that's a big privacy issue. And it's at the heart of their business models for advertising and personalization.
Thank you. I'm a little bit conscious of the time, but Andreas, would you like to add to that answer?
Yeah, well, I try also to link it with the question by Ray and try to make it very focused. So you're highlighting a very important point, Francois. First, basically, I'm not worried about a plural self or the multiplicity of the self. So Lahia has written a great book on this many years ago. So I think this is rather an expression of modernity or late modernity. The point really, in my perspective, is the question, what do companies do with that? And here, practically, I would say, I would only use devices from companies at this moment of time whose business model is selling the devices and doing nothing with the data. So this is much more secure than companies who more or less give their devices cheaply away, but make their money out of the data. And I never ever would use something which is software only, because then it's only about data. And this brings me to the other point, which somehow relates to the question Ray had. In my perspective, fundamentally, I think we should begin to discuss the question of ownership of digital data. Yeah? And in principle, I have a quite radical position on that. And this means that each person should have, on a fundamental level, the ownership of his or her digital data, and should be in the position to decide whom he or she will give the data, and only by active consent. So there are particular companies who go into this direction. For example, Apple. Many, even companies in advertising complained about the latest changes in iOS, for example. But even Apple, it's the first little step. It should be much more radical. And from my point of view, there should be only something which we might call data donations. So I donate my data to someone. I can donate my data to a company, of course, if I want. Or I donate my data, for example, to a particular kind of civil society organization, which does something out of this data I understand as positive or good. But what we should limit is, and this is the relation to digital resignation, that I can only use particular kind of technologies if my data is used without further consent, because I have no control what's being done later on with this data. And the problem of this data is it's not just a representation of me, it is a representation of my practices alongside a business model. So this data is always collected with an underlying business model, and by this limited in scope. And in that area, I think we must have a much deeper political discussion than we have it now. And this is really it's a highly important problem in my perspective when it comes to these digital technologies of self-measurement, but also even far beyond when we're talking about platforms and so on and so on.
Thank you. I know that that kind of there would be a lot more interesting discussions to be had around this, but I'm conscious of the time, so I want to kind of thank our panelists for kind of presenting their viewpoints and research on this. We started a few minutes late, so I think we are exactly on time. So I want to kind of thank you for the panelists, thank you everybody on YouTube, and also thank you everybody who has been in the session and asking us questions. And of course, since this is a Zoom session, don't kind of stop here, reach out to the panelists, reach out to me if there's further idea or question you want to pose or discuss more.